And we're recording. So good evening, everybody, and welcome to the New York City PowerShell user group. My name's Doug Fink. I organize the group along with Sunny, who I think is on the line in the chat. And I'm a PowerShell MVP since 2009. I think Don's been an MVP longer than I have. So we're going to kick off with his talk in a minute about shell of an idea. But before we get going, just wanted to bring your attention to a couple things. Everybody here has probably been on the meetup.com. That's where you got the link to get to tonight's talk. Next month, July, we have Max Trinidad from Sapien. He's going to talk about working with Docker containers in Windows 10. So if you want to jump on there and RSVP if you want to hear about how to use Docker, and he'll be showing some stuff with PowerShell. It should be a really good talk. And we have some folks lined up for August and September as well, which we'll be announcing soon. Also, I'll put a link in the chat. This recording, I'll send out a message to everybody who's joined. And we'll put it up on this YouTube link, and you can see some of the talks we had before about flexible formatting. And we had one talk on PowerShell using Jupyter notebooks. So you can get up there and see those and see the upcoming ones from tonight and going forward. A little commercial announcement. So Sapien Technologies makes this possible for us to run these. They sponsor us. And these are some of the great productivity tools that they have. PowerShell Studio is great. It's a little bit different than ISE, and it's a little bit different in Visual Studio Code. It's definitely worth checking out. They have free 45-day full functional trials that you would like to, if you want to try them out before buying. And they're at sapien.com. So I definitely encourage you to go check that out. So for tonight, if you want, you can raise your hand in the participant window, and I'll see that, and then I can unmute you if you want to ask questions during the talk, or you can just go ahead and type your questions into the chat, and I'll keep an eye on that, and we'll pose those questions to Don or whoever as we go. So with that, let's kick off. I'd like to introduce Don Jones. He's been in the IT industry since the mid-90s. He's been working with PowerShell since before the 2006 launch, back when it was called Monad. He's a co-founder of the PowerShell.org and PowerShell Summit, and he was named the PowerShell first follower by none other than the inventor of PowerShell, Jeffrey Snover. Don's written dozens of IT books, business books, self-improvement books, including the first ever published books on Windows PowerShell. So Don, I'm really glad to have you here tonight. How are you?
I'm doing well.
So if you're ready to go.
Yeah, I think so. And I've got the chat window up too. So, you know, if you've got a question or something as we go, I can kind of keep an eye on that and talk at the same time.
Perfect.
So look, welcome everyone. Thanks for being here. I've been doing a couple of sessions on around this, the untold history of PowerShell, and they've all been different. And you guys are kind of getting the first one I came up with, which is the one I've been the most excited to do. And it really, I kind of want to hit you with a few of the hidden little things in PowerShell, hit you with, you know, where did such and such come from, and really give you kind of a glimpse of how impossible it was to get PowerShell out the door at Microsoft. Like, just really develop an appreciation for the personalities and just the chutzpah of everyone on the team who managed to make this product a reality. So that's what we're going to do today. I've worked with PowerShell since before the 2006 launch, as Doug said. I co-presented on stage with Jeffrey Snover at TechEd Europe in 2006. That's where they launched PowerShell. I was working for Sapien Technologies at the time, and we had already updated PrimalScript to support PowerShell, and Jeffrey wanted to show that off and show that there was an ecosystem around it. That photo is from me on PowerShell's 6th birthday in 2012. I have a lot more gray now. I've been at PowerShell for about 14 years. So who do we have to thank for actually making PowerShell a thing? Like, if you were to go all the way back in time to the very, very beginning, where was PowerShell's genesis? And it turns out it's a little company called Intel. And most people don't know that. And here's what happened. Intel, back in the day, and we're talking late 90s, really, they were using Sun SPARC stations to do all of their CPU engineering. And those SPARC stations ran Solaris. It's a variant of Unix. So Intel wasn't even using Intel chips to design Intel chips. They were using RISC-based workstations, engineering workstations. And it was frankly a little embarrassing. The CEO of Intel at the time thought, I mean, do our chips suck that much? Well, the answer was, no, actually they didn't. The Intel chips were decent. They were powerful enough, but there was no operating system out there at the time that could really leverage what they needed. And so they needed an operating system so they could move all of their chip design to Intel-based computers. And Bill Gates said, we got your back. We are going to do this for you. So started digging into it. And obviously NT was a thing by then. And you know, we're right at the point now. So this is, again, late 90s. We're right at the point where we're starting to move away from Windows 95, Windows 98, Windows ME, blah. And we're just about to kind of leap into the world of everybody uses NT. So that would be Windows 2000, and then eventually in 2002 XP, that kind of time frame. So Bill said, we're gonna do what we need to do to the operating system to help you out. But as they dug into it, they realized that Intel had this massive reliance on Korn shell scripts in Solaris. So Korn is one of the more popular Unix shells, along with Bash and C shell, which a lot of people have heard of. They used a ton of scripts to do a lot of automation. And I mean, you guys know how scripting is, right? You know, once you've written 20,000 lines of script, if somebody comes up to you and says, hey, could you rewrite that in Python? You'd be like, no, I'm going to quit my job. I don't want to rewrite it in Python. It took me too long to write this, and if I touch it, it'll break. And that's exactly how Intel felt. And so Bill said, all right, you know what we're going to do? We're going to get our services for Unix people to port Korn shell to Windows. And that project was codenamed Kermit, not after the frog, but after the hero of a Bill Peet book called Kermit the Hermit, because he was a hermit crab, so he had a shell. Get it? And it started with a K. You know, code names back in the day weren't thought of too rigorously. But it turns out, as they dug into this, and they really, I mean, they made decent progress at porting Korn shell to run on Windows. It turns out it was all a lie. Intel kind of set Microsoft down this path because they wanted to see Microsoft make Intel chips look better, and so they wanted these operating system improvements. But it turns out Intel had always been planning to move to a Linux-based platform anyway. They were working on a custom Linux distro, and Linux is Unix, basically, and so it already ran all their scripts and all their software and everything else. So this whole red herring, though, did something interesting. It created a team. And I want you to think of what it would take to create a team inside your own company, right? We're talking headcount, budget, office space, laptops for people, right? There's a lot of money involved in creating a team. And Microsoft had set up a team. They'd set up the Kermit team, headed by a program manager named Darryl Ray, by the way, who I interviewed pretty extensively for the book, and that's where a lot of this background information came from. So they had a team. They were working on it. They were using some of their services for Unix folks, and the team had budget, and the team had headcount. And if you work at Microsoft and you've got budget and you've got headcount, you can get stuff done. And along came a guy who wanted to hijack the Kermit team. Now, Jeffrey had been hired into the company to work on automation. And one of the things you'll read in the book, I think this is fascinating, they gave him a few $million. Like, wrap your head around that. They gave him a few $million to go help increase command coverage, meaning, you know, our admins and our enterprise customers are telling us that they can't automate enough stuff because they don't have commands to do everything. So we need you to go get a bunch of commands written. So he went out and hired contractors. For a few $million, he got about 40 commands out the door. It was very expensive. And so he had started to think through other ways that this could be done. And if you've ever used the WMI console, WMIC, that was Jeffrey's big invention before Monad became a thing. And the thing he did there, he spent, I think, a few $100,000 to create that, and it had this massive command coverage because it was using WMI under the hood, and it was doing all this cool stuff with the underlying XML and blah, blah, blah. So it got this huge bang for his buck. And that kind of triggered him to thinking about how could we do this better. And then he found out that there was this Kermit team off to the side, and they were just going to port Corn Shell over to Windows. And he said, you know, I got a better idea. We can do way better than that if we write our own shell using some of these concepts that I came up with for WMIC. Now, interestingly, Microsoft had another Unix-flavored problem because they had just bought a Unix-based email service that they wanted to migrate to Windows. And if you remember Hotmail, then you know what I'm talking about. An entire huge white paper that was supposed to be internal only was written, and it wound up being leaked on the internet, of course, because of the internet. But it was because it was supposed to be internal only, it was very candid about where Windows fell down, where Windows wasn't good enough. And the biggest hurdle was a lack of strong command line tools. So this problem with automation in Windows was real. Like, Microsoft may not have been talking about the problem publicly, but they knew it was a real issue. Everyone in the company knew it was an issue, and everyone in the company knew that they were going to have to do something about it. So Jeffrey, and there's a whole fun story about how he basically took a demotion. He said, you know what, I want to go with this Kermit team, I want to hijack that team, and I want to do a command line shell. And his boss said, well, I don't know if you can do that because of your performance problems. And he goes, I'm sorry, my what? What? Why have I never heard about my performance problems before? So there was a whole little political thing. It's a really, really good story. It's like the beginning of every single hurdle. Like, every time Jeffrey turned around to try and do something with PowerShell, someone put a block in his way. And he and the rest of the people on the team just managed to, it's funny, they didn't knock many of them down. They just weaseled their way around a lot of them. And I think that's what makes it such an interesting story. And it tells us so much about why PowerShell is the way it is today. All right, so we know we got a problem. Jeffrey has moved over to this team, and he's trying to get them going, but they've got another problem. So one of the ways Jeffrey was able to get budget for this, to continue working on all this, was to position the software developers in Microsoft's new Hyderabad Development Center. So the India Development Center, the IDC. There was an executive who was in charge of Windows Client at the time, who was a big, big advocate for the Indian Development Center, and he wanted stuff there. And if you were willing to put your development there, then he would find you budget. And so they did that. But like, you're talking people in India and people in Washington State. There's like 12 and a half time zones between the two. So with all of your project management people in Washington and all of your developers in India, your cycles for asking a question and getting an answer are extremely long. Jeffrey said, you know, there were times he was waking up at 4 or 5 in the morning to catch them at the end of the day, and then he would go back at 8 at night to catch them in their morning. And so he wrote a book called the Monad Manifesto. And this was, it's relatively short, and it was mainly intended to help the programmers in India get the vision so that they could operate more autonomously. A lot of people think that the manifesto was the first thing Jeffrey wrote, and then a bunch of people bought off on it, and then they started doing PowerShell, and that's not true. The manifesto was an attempt to mitigate the time zones that they were dealing with their development team. DevOps Collective has an annotated version of this. It's free. You can get it. It's through LeanPub. And I highly recommend you read it. It's a great historical artifact. It's not long. It's only a dozen pages or so. And it really helps you understand like how Jeffrey was thinking about this. So what happens next? In the manifesto, he said, we're going to have 4 capabilities: a composable command line shell. And guess what? We got that in version 1. We're going to offer remote manageability. That was his second big capability, and we got that in version 2. We need to have resumable, long-running tasks, and we got that in version 3 with workflow. We didn't get the workflow that we probably should have had. There are some political reasons for that. All that's in the book too, if you're interested. But we did get something. And then at the end, the last thing is we want declarative configuration, and we got that in v4. And I want to point out that this was a document Jeffrey wrote back in 2003 or so, 2003, 2004 maybe. And the last thing he imagined was what became desired state configuration years later. So this was an extremely visionary document that guided PowerShell through its first 4 versions. Close to a decade of software development was guided by that vision. It's a really, really good document to just sit down and scan. So, okay, we have all those things, but first, before we could have any of that, they actually had to get version 1 out the door. Now, as most of you know, Exchange Server 2007 was the product that shipped PowerShell v1. And there's a fun story about that. We're going to get into a little bit about that in just a sec, but it's kind of a cool story. Jeffrey says he never came to work for Microsoft. He came to work for this one guy that he had known at Digital, and he came to Microsoft at that guy's request, and he worked at Microsoft. That guy moved into a different org. Jeffrey stayed behind. Jeffrey moved, the guy moved again, right? It's like the guy was always just 2 steps ahead of him. Well, as it turns out, that guy was in charge of Exchange Server and happened to run into Jeffrey in a hallway. And man, if you think hallway conversations don't drive the world, runs into Jeffrey. Actually, I think he said he was walking out of a building. And, they start talking, and the guy says, yeah, the Exchange team is really doubling down on automation because we see on our roadmap how this is going to become an online offering. Like, they were already thinking about Exchange Online. He said, there's no way we can do it with the way administration works right now. It's just impossible. And so the team is developing this entire layer for automation in Exchange. And Jeffrey said, that's funny because I'm working on this thing called Monad, and we pretty much were just told that we're not going to be able to ship in Windows, so we're looking for a customer. The guy said, you should go talk to my guys. And at that moment, PowerShell version 1 became an Exchange product. Exchange was the customer. A lot of the decisions they made on what got shipped and what got held back for later had to do with the Exchange team's priorities. They had to be the best vendor the Exchange team had ever had, and they were. And Exchange shipped. It had first-class PowerShell support. It probably is the best PowerShell support of any product Microsoft has ever shipped, because the Exchange team needed this to accomplish a business goal. They weren't just doing this to make some administrators shut up. They needed this to accomplish a business goal. In fact, there's a quote in the book from somebody who was on that team who said, Microsoft's current world of being a cloud-based company is pretty much due to PowerShell. Because if we didn't have PowerShell, we probably would not have gotten Exchange Online, and we probably would not have used that as a launching point to Office 365, to Azure, to everything else. So not many folks remember that PowerShell started in the Windows Client business unit. The Windows teams, and when it did make the shift over to the server team, which did happen, the Windows teams, like Windows runs on billions of computers, right? And the one thing everybody yells about is security and stability. Like that's all they want from their operating system really is security and stability. And there was not a lot of love for .NET at the time. .NET had some real versioning issues around the time. So PowerShell version 1 shipped, I believe, on .NET 2.0, and it had some real versioning issues, and they were really concerned about those versioning issues. They were concerned about anything .NET related. Ken Hansen, who's one of the program managers for PowerShell at the time, and for a long time, said it was kind of funny. The Windows team put up what they called these 7 gates, and there were 7 things you had to be able to clear before you could get in the box and ship with the operating system. And then there was like the secret 8th gate for .NET things where they just said no. And so the PowerShell team had to push their way through all of that. And another problem they had was you know, one of the whole things about PowerShell is it's extensible, right? You can plug things into it. Today we plug modules into it, but in the beginning it was PS snap-ins. And some, you know, a Windows architect said, well, you know, where are these snap-ins going to come from? And the team said, well, I mean, you'll just download them. And they're like, whoa, 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 whoa. We are done with downloadable snap-in extension plug-in type things. We are over it because Internet Explorer has put us over the coals on it. So that became another problem. Interestingly, one of the ways they got around that was by calling them snap-ins, because the Microsoft Management Console, if you remember, used snap-ins and it shipped with the operating system. So they're able to say, look, we're basically just the same as this thing you already like, and so why don't you let us do it? They, if you remember, we didn't get modules until version 2 of PowerShell, and a lot of people will ask, you know, is there ever any consideration of including modules in V1? And it turns out there was. There absolutely was. They went to the Windows architecture team and said, we can do this in one of two ways. We can do modules, and modules are what they call an X-copy deploy, right? You just copy the files from one place to another, boom, you're installed, that's it. Or we can do this snap-in thing, which has to get installed and registered, and it goes in the registry. And they had two Windows architects, and one said, oh, I prefer modules because it's lighter weight, it's easier, you know, let's not put stuff in the registry if we can avoid it. The other guy said, no, I prefer snap-ins because if it's registered in the registry, we know it's there and we know where it is, and so when it comes time to deploy a patch, we know if we need to deploy it and we know where to deploy the patch. And Jeffrey looked back and forth. And the second guy, the snap-in guy, had more political clout, so he said, that's what we're going to do. And we got modules later. So it's these, like, the reason PowerShell works the way it does in a lot of cases is just because of the sheer politics of it all. All right. So I'm going to back off the history a little bit and talk about some of the unique things PowerShell brought, because even today, some of these things are really non-obvious. PowerShell was the first object-oriented shell, to the point where Microsoft has a bunch of patents around its object-orientatedness. And a lot of folks will, I think they'll get spun up in their heads about what object-oriented means, but it's real simple. It's structured data. Command line tools up to that point were text-based, which means they were spewing out unstructured data. Right? The only structure you had was maybe a tab character between columns. PowerShell was object-oriented, and that is what has made it successful for so many people, is because you can focus on what you're doing and you don't have to focus on munging data in between steps. It does it for you. It has an extensible type system. That's something else that, believe it or not, had never been done to that point. The idea of taking an object that was produced by software somewhere in the computer and then adding bits to it to make it easier to use that object for the specific purpose of administration was brand new. So that's another issue, another unique thing. Highly verbose command names. Look, anyone who's used a Unix shell knows that there's some kind of global shortage on letters in the world, and so your command names have to be as short and as obscure as possible for job security, I guess. PowerShell was the first to use really verbose command names. It took its basic verb-noun structure from operating systems like VAX or OS 400 because they use something very, very similar, but they didn't use verbose. Like if you wanted to work with jobs on an AS 400, it was WRKJOB, work job. Like your verb was always 3 letters and your noun was always 3 letters, so there wasn't a lot of room for imagination. But the idea of spelling everything out so your code becomes self-documenting, like that was new. No one had done that in a shell before. Providers. The idea of an adapter that can make things look like a disk drive, something we're all familiar with, was brand new. Now, you can kind of argue that the Linux operating system has always done something like that. Like at the end of the day, nearly everything on Linux is a file or a folder. But to extend that out to SQL databases and Active Directory and the registry and environment variables and function storage, like everything was stored in a provider. It was a big deal. It's funny. when the PowerShell team was creating the API that you would use to write commandlets, like real commandlets, they actually did usability testing. They would sit developers down and say, okay, write a commandlet, and they'd watch the mistakes that those developers made, and they would go change the API so that it was easier and more intuitive. Like, they wanted this to be a good experience for developers, because then developers would write commandlets and then the shell would be successful. They didn't do that with the provider API. Some of it was just time. They didn't have time to do it. Some of it was the feeling that providers would be written by a few more skilled, more experienced developers, and so they would be able to deal with it. Unfortunately, providers never took off like they might have. People use them, we all use them, but they never like blew up the world like the team thought, in part because there just might not have been enough investment in making them easier and more straightforward for developers to get into. PowerShell has some roots in POSIX. Now, POSIX is the portable operating system interface based on Unix. Windows NT has always had a POSIX subsystem in addition to the Win32 subsystem we all know and love. In POSIX, variables start with a $sign. Does that sound familiar? It has sub-expressions where you have a $sign in parentheses, and then it'll execute whatever's in the parentheses. POSIX has pipelines, as do many other shells. Kermit, remember, was supposed to be a Corn shell port. Windows already has a POSIX subsystem. So in theory, all they were trying to do was just make Corn shell run in POSIX, and Intel would have been happy. So a lot of these design decisions kind of came from those POSIX roots, and that's why they're there. So why is this called splatting? I actually did not know the reason for this. I've talked about splatting a lot. I've shown people how to do it. So it's where you take a variable, in this case x, and you build a hash table. And so I've got two keys, computer name and class name, and each of those have a value. And then I can run a command, and I refer to the variable by an @ sign instead of a $sign. And that kind of expands those out. And my keys, computer name and class name, map to the parameters, computer name and class name, and it feeds them those values. But I never understood why it was called splatting. Well, it's because it came from Ruby. In the Ruby programming language, instead of using an @ sign to expand the variable, you used the asterisk, which computer people call the splat character, because it looks like you splatted a bug on the sheet of paper. And so that's the little splat. That's why it's called splatting, is because it's called splatting in Ruby. There's a bunch of hidden history in PowerShell. I don't know if any of you are aware of the filter construct. You don't need to be. It's completely pointless, because as they were developing it, they created this filter construct that was designed to basically be a custom where object. Like you could build your own where object commandlets using the filter construct. But then they had the idea to make functions themselves more robust. And so functions gained a begin, process, and end block. And functions can do everything a filter does. And they could have left filter out. They didn't. It didn't occur to anyone to take it out of the language before they shipped it. And once you ship it, you can't take it out because someone may be using it and you would break their stuff. Why do we use minus parameter and not backslash parameter? Keep in mind that one of the goals here was to appeal to Unix people. And a lot of Unix commands use a backslash to denote a command line parameter. But Windows uses backslash as a file path separator. And they wanted to be able to use backslash or slash. So people from Windows would feel comfortable, people from Unix would feel comfortable, everyone would feel comfortable. And so we got a minus. Why version 1.0 could be so slow to start? It's because .NET uses this thing called just-in-time compilation. And the first time you run an application, your executable isn't an executable. It's Microsoft Intermediate Language. It's MSIL. And the .NET Common Language Runtime, the CLR, has to compile that to binary code based on the system it finds itself on. So in theory, you could put it on an Intel machine or a RISC machine, and it would still run so long as the CLR could run on that machine. And so when you would start version 1 for the first time, it would just take forever to compile all the assemblies that made PowerShell work. Well, in a later update, they thought, the odds of this running on anything but an Intel machine are pretty slim. So we're just going to pre-compile native binaries and ship those so that it'll boot up right away. And if it's on another architecture, it can still do a just-in-time compile, but that's like 2 people on the whole planet. And yeah, Sunny points out, a lot of us would use NGen, which stands for native generator, and that would basically compile everything into natives that weren't pre-compiled. So you were pre-compiling yourself. We would use that to fix the speed-up problem. I remember doing it every time I built a machine. So that there's lots more in there. There's just a ton of tiny little hidden, tricky bit things. There's a book for it, of course. If you really get into this stuff, like if you geek out about PowerShell, you're gonna love the book. Even if you don't, if you want the history of the people, and like so I'll tell you a really good story. This is just an example of how much fun I had writing this book and how much fun I had interviewing all of these different people. Jeffrey talks about a time when he had to go to a Bill Gates review. Now, I'm sure you guys have heard the legends of the Bill G reviews, where you get 2 slides into your presentation and he starts literally cursing at you, screaming at the top of his lungs, calling you stupid, and kicks you out of his office. So, Bill's like that, or was. He's probably settled down now. He's a little older. Jeffrey kind of geared himself up, and he walked into the office, and there was the people from the Windows architecture team were there, and he said, "Uh-oh, I have been set up." And they said, "Yeah, we can't ship this because it's inconsistent. It's going to confuse people." And Jeffrey's like, "What the hell are you talking about, inconsistent, confuse people?" They said, "Well, this remoting thing," because keep in mind, remoting almost shipped in V1. The guts of remoting were in V1. They just didn't have time to finish it and make it stable. That's why we didn't get it until V2. But the Windows architecture guys had looked at it in V1. And they said when you run a command locally, you get a live object. It's got methods. It can update itself. But when you run a command remotely, you get back a dead object. It's static. There's no methods because it's not maintaining a connection to that remote machine. And, that's just inconsistent and confusing. And Bill kind of nodded, and he looked at Jeffrey, and Jeffrey thought, well, I need to pull something out of my butt here. So here's the story he told. He says, I just got these eyeglasses. They're bifocals. And before, I had 2 different pairs of glasses. I had one for sitting in front of the computer and reading, and another for, like everyday distance vision. He said, but it was a pain in the neck. Like I'm constantly going back and forth between these 2 different things. Each of those things presented me a consistent view, but I'm in different situations all the time. And as I moved between those different situations, I had to switch to a different tool. And that was very inconvenient. I didn't like it. He said these bifocals, on the other hand, they present an inconsistent view. Depending on how I look through them, things might be clear or they might be fuzzy. But it only takes me a couple of days to get used to that inconsistency. And then the benefit is I've got one tool that works in all my situations. And so it actually is more convenient, and it makes me more powerful, not confused. And Bill smiled and said, yeah, good enough, you're good to go. So it's just, again, I probably interviewed, I probably interviewed over a dozen people for the book. There's probably 30, 40 hours of interviews packed into this. It's guys like Bill Payette and Lee Holmes. Like if you've never heard of AMSI, the Anti-Malware Scanning Interface, which is present in Windows and is used by almost every single anti-malware vendor to prevent PowerShell malware from getting into the system, as well as other scripting languages, right? Not just PowerShell. Lee Holmes basically invented that. And it's a core part of the operating system, and that whole story is in there too. It's just it's a great story. Just so you're clear, I focused mainly getting PowerShell through version 2. After that, I think the history is a lot clearer. It's that background stuff. When I realized that there's so many of the people who are on the team who aren't at Microsoft anymore. Ken Hansen has left. Angel Calvos has left. June Bender has left. There's not many left, and I was really afraid that this history, these stories, and like the passion that these people put into this product for us would get lost. And so that's why I wanted to do the book. All right, I think that's my last one. I'm scanning the chat window here to see if there's anything. You guys can bring the questions now. Yeah, Sunny's right. Nearly everyone is at Amazon now. They all moved over to Amazon Web Services, where they are still working with PowerShell, incidentally. So what do you think, Doug? Did you find that interesting?
That was fantastic, Don. Really appreciate it. Filled in a lot of pieces that I didn't know about. So did you really read the first book, or was it the first book on PowerShell called Monad?
So the first published book on PowerShell I wrote when I was at Sapient Technologies.
Oh.
Somebody had put out a book on Monad, but I mean, it had like a 3-month shelf life, the poor guy.
Exactly. Well, you wrote that book with Sapient?
Yeah, it was Windows PowerShell TFM.
Yes,
I think we did a few editions of that. Jeff Hicks helped me with that. He co-authored that with me. And then when we had moved on, I'm fairly certain there were subsequent editions in fact, I know there were subsequent editions by other folks. So yeah, Sapient's been pretty connected to PowerShell since the very beginning.
Definitely. So if anybody's got questions, if you want to raise your hand and we can unmute you want to ask a question or type them in, that'd be great.
Yeah, so Jim asked, wasn't there a brief time where PowerShell was called MSH, Microsoft Shell? The code name was always Monad. The presumption in the team's head was that it was going to be called Microsoft Shell. So there's two things there. Product naming is owned by marketing, not by the product team. And marketing was concerned because inside Microsoft, when you say the word shell, you're referring to the graphical user interface. You're referring to the start menu and the windowing system. That's what Microsoft calls the shell. Literally no other software company in the universe would call that a shell, but they do. And so they were concerned about calling it Microsoft Shell. So they came up with a bunch of names, and I don't have a copy of the book. There's a whole section in design decisions in the book about some of the goofy names they came up with. And Microsoft finally came up with PowerShell, and almost everybody on the team was like, blah. I mean, even Bob Muglia, who was like the Lord God High Master at the time, was like, blah. And so marketing said, well, we'll do a survey. And so they did a survey, and it was one of these things like, does the name PowerShell make you vomit, yes or no? And if a lot of people said no, then it tested very positively, so we should go with that. So they kind of pushed it through. But they did own the name. There was a Unix shell that like 5 people in the universe were using at the time called PowerShell. And so they actually had to get in touch with that person and make sure that they were going to be clear. That's why it came out as Windows PowerShell, not just PowerShell.
I remember the jokes around PowerShell, which I'm not going to repeat online, but they were kind of funny early on. But I didn't know that Unix had a PowerShell. That's cool. We have a couple of hands raised.
Go for it.
So Peter Bishop, see if I can unmute you.
I think I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hey, fantastic. Doug, thank you very much. Don, this is a pleasure. I remember watching you many years back. I remember you were the dude with the vest and the dude who said, if you use Righthosts, something's going to be killed.
Yeah.
Something's going to die. What was cool about that is that I have meandered my way through different projects and different jobs because of just latching on to PowerShell at a time when I wasn't a Unix man. It was too terse, and Perl didn't quite do things for me. The funny thing now is that I still prefer Righthosts because Right Output doesn't give me that kind of visual stuff. I know there are plugins from Doug and different people, but now PowerShell is being wrapped into different things like Puppet and different things like that. So I'm curious,
Yep.
Are you involved in projects where, at the core there's PowerShell, but it's a whole different thing?
I'm not. The idea of PowerShell being wrapped into other products, though, was always something that was intended. And in fact, there was an intent to have it be even more capable of that. Unfortunately, what happened is one of the developers who was doing some of the core stuff only understood standard in, standard out, and standard error. He didn't understand this idea of these complex data streams. So, we have pipelines now The intent was for you to be able to create your own arbitrary pipeline, put stuff into it, bifurcate it, do separate lines of processing, do like conditional, okay, if it's not in this condition, it goes to this pipe, and then it'll loop back around, it'll recurse. They get all that planned, and that developer basically screwed them out of it. And it's a worthy lesson, because the downside of Righthost is that you are tying yourself to the host window. That's why I encourage people to not use it unless they understand what it is that they're doing. When you use write output, if you've written a script that's running in System Center Operations Manager, which embeds the PowerShell engine, it can capture that output. It can't capture anything for host. It doesn't implement the host channel. So it's understanding what those different channels are used for. But no, I've kind of moved out of working with PowerShell on a daily basis. I'm at Pluralsight now. I'm vice president for content partnerships, and it does not leave me a lot of time to stick with the technology. In a lot of ways, Shell of an Idea is kind of my swan song to the community. Like, I wanted to give something to really celebrate where this has all come from and how long it's been here, and all the people, both in the community and in Microsoft, that contributed and were impacted by it. Simply because I'm not really that connected to it. I'm not even sure I have PowerShell on my Mac right now, which kind of tells you something.
Cool.
Hey, Don, this is Sunny. I have a question about Alan LeSueur, who was the Development program manager who wrote some of the original books, especially the Development, the two Development books. Did you get to talk to him as part of researching this book? Because he did a lot of foundational things with WMI, which kind of made it to PowerShell as well.
Yeah, I don't think so. There was a lot of folks that it was a little hard to track down, and I was also trying to stay as connected to a narrative as I could and really follow that. There's a lot of former program managers that I went back and forth with email on as opposed to having an actual interview with. I had scheduled time at the beginning of April to fly up to Redmond and spend a few days and actually do face-to-face interviews. And you can imagine how that turned out. So we did a lot of phone interviews and did a lot more emails. I want to grab one on here. John posted, can you offer any history behind the reason that functions don't distinguish between the return value and write output? Yeah. That was a case of the team trying too hard to make things easy on you. The return keyword, when it's used anywhere but a class, in a class it works like it ought to work. They knew that programmers who write functions use the keyword return, and so what it does is it basically is write output under the hood, and then it exits. But if you've already written output, then you're getting more output than you expected. It was entirely, they wanted to make the shell accessible to developers. They wanted to give them the things that they're used to seeing in a language, and they just didn't think kind of about the ramifications of doing that, and they kind of deeply regret it. But at this point, you can't change it or it'll break people's stuff.
So I'm going to post in your swag, your digital swag there, Don.
Oh yeah, pop that in the chat room. So for everybody who knows it, LeanPub lets you pay what you want for books. As the author, I can set a minimum price. They keep a commission. They keep a 20% commission, which is very reasonable, and they show you exactly how much I get paid. So you can pay what you want. This link, which is in the chat window, will only be good for 24 hours. It will reduce the minimum price of the book to $15, and then you can pay whatever you feel you would like to pay above that. Please don't share that out. Like, just keep it to yourself. If you're watching the play later, you're not going to be able to get that. That's the benefit of showing up live for these things. But go ahead and please do that. Like, I really recommend you grab a copy of the book and read it. You're gonna enjoy it. It's gonna kind of, you're gonna feel closer to PowerShell in a human way that you probably might not have before. Just really understanding some of the pain and the battles and the clever weaseling around that the team did to get through things. There's some just fantastic stories from some fantastic people.
Yeah, thanks for that link.
And you get to learn what the Hula Monkey is.
Yeah, I was going to ask that question too, but yeah, I'll get my copy. It's always good to hear about the people behind building cool stuff like this. So you can talk about the Hula Monkey? Oh, did I lose you? Don, can you still hear us, or are you?
See, I don't have the participant list. Somebody said John Malls is online. Hi, John.
So are you going to talk about the Hula Monkey? Don, can you hear me? No? Don, are you still with us?
Can you guys hear me? Post something still? I'm not sure if my audio dropped.
Your audio might have dropped. I think I was asking you about the Hula Monkey as well. I don't know if you heard that. Nope, I think we lost your audio.
All right, so since someone asked, I'll tell you, this is an appendix. There's actually a picture of this in the book. So it's worth getting the ebook version because it's a color photo. If you order a print version on Amazon, it's black and white. So, you know, back when PowerShell was being written, this was before Git was a thing. Like there was no Git, there was no GitHub. People used Visual Source Safe. Like that, this was before Team Foundation Services, right? People used VSS, and if you ever used VSS, it was a pretty crappy product if you were on a large team. It couldn't handle things. And it was not uncommon for people to try and do check-ins in the PowerShell team and like break a lot of stuff, like they would lose code. And so they had a Hula Monkey, and it's one of those coconut monkey dolls with a grass hula skirt. And if you wanted to check in code, you had to go get the Hula Monkey. And if somebody else had the Hula Monkey, you couldn't check in code. And they actually still have this thing. They have a display case up on campus, just a little like trophy case with, you know, some T-shirts from the early days and some you know, plaques, and the Hula Monkey is in there. So somebody took a photo of it and sent it to me. I just think that's an extra funny piece of history there.
That's funny.
So I've got time for one or two more questions if anybody wants to pop them in the are there any good fact stories or interviews that didn't make it into the book? Everything I did, everyone I talked to, and pretty much everything they told me made it in. I couldn't talk to everybody. There's some folks just have disappeared. Some of them just aren't in a position where they felt comfortable going on the record with some of the crazy stories. But everything that I was able to gather is in the book. There's a lot of it. How was it doing demos with Jeffrey? Here, I'm going to look this up because I want to see what in fact, I'll get the URL and I'll post it. Jeffrey is a super fun guy to present with, but he's really only comfortable if he can really super plan everything in advance. And then almost invariably, he'll do that and then just go off on a tangent and do something completely different anyway. All right, here, I'll put this in the chat window. So this is a really funny one to watch if you get a chance. It's one of the PowerShell Unplugged sessions, and it's like if you can go up and just have a lot of fun. Jeffrey's awesome. I would not prepare at all because I knew no matter what I prepared, he would run 30 minutes over anyway with just his stuff. So I would just sit there and riff. And when he would like go off on this deep tangent or use some ridiculous acronym or something, I would be the one to explain it to the ordinary human beings in the room who just weren't that smart, like me. And so in this one, I don't think you see me. And so I'm going to tell you what happens. Jeffrey's demonstrating, and it's probably about halfway through. He's trying to demonstrate how the PowerShell ISE is actually a programming object, and you can, you know, type, you know, $ ISE ... and you know he changes the font size to 24 point, and then he changes it back to 12 point just programmatically. I'd never seen that. Like I knew it was programmatic because I knew that like Tobias had been doing all sorts of stuff with ISC steroids and all that, but I didn't care. Like whatever, you know, just didn't impact my life. So I saw that, I thought that's cool. Well, so Jeffrey now, he steps in front of the podium that we've been using. We've been using his laptop because I use a Mac and he refuses to touch one. So he steps around to the front of the podium and he's waving his arms, he's pontificating about something, and I just step up and I'm like, ISE dot font, like whatever it is, dot font equals 2000. And it goes boom, and like the screen contains the letter G, and that's it. And everybody kind of laughs, but they laugh at the exact time he just tells a joke. And they're not laughing at his joke. It was a bad joke. They're laughing because I've just blown up Jeffrey's computer, and now I can't see to type to change it back. So I'm like, oh, shit. And he's going to catch me, and I'm going to blow his next demo for him. So I'm like, okay, up arrow, backspace, 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 12, enter, and it zoops back down. I'm being super careful, and everyone can see me do it, and they're all giggling. He just realizes that they're not giggling at him, and he turns around and goes, what are you doing? I go, nothing. And then everybody busts up. And you can hear all of that. I don't know that you can see it all like that because they didn't cut the camera enough to actually catch it. But he's a lot of fun to present with for sure. All right, I think I am going to run. I'm kind of at my time. But thanks so much for showing up and listening. When the recording goes up, please tell everybody to go catch it. Please consider getting a copy of the book. I really want to this to be successful and for those stories to get out there and stay out there for people. So I'll sign off. Doug, thanks so much for having me.
Thanks,
and I hope everybody has a great night.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good night. Bye.